All right, thank you all for coming to hear Professor Dana Frank speak on her book. We're very grateful to have her here. I'm especially personally grateful for her work. I'm the pastor here at Faith Mennonite Church, and last year we were able to find a way to get two families out of detention from the caravan, and they joined us in the Twin Cities, and this has been a tremendous opportunity for our church for growing in solidarity. Professor Frank's book came just at the right time for me as a pastor and as a leader in the community, trying to unravel the complex situation in Honduras, both its longer history and then just especially its recent history. It's difficult to find reliable information and scholarship on Honduras. It's often kind of a forgotten place, and I think in scholarship, and so your work has been extremely valuable to me at a personal level, and valuable for our community as well as the Minnesota Caravan Solidarity Group. And we're so grateful that you have come here to join us and share with us your work. So I'll pass it on to Liz to introduce you. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming, everyone. It's so great to be here. My name is Liz Molden. I'm the regional organizer for Witness for Peace. Can you hear me? And Witness for Peace is a regional organization that works to promote human rights across the Americas by changing U.S. foreign policy and corporate practices across the hemisphere. We do this by standing in solidarity with our partners on the ground in 4 Latin American countries in Cuba, Honduras, Mexico, and Colombia. We're so excited and thrilled and privileged to have Dana with us here, who will be sharing with you more about the book. I just wanted to take a few moments to recognize that today, March 2nd, is the anniversary of the assassination of the activist and land defender Berta Cáceres. And so behind you, you'll see this lit little altar in memory of her and all the activists and all the migrants and asylum seekers who are currently crossing and endangered, criminalized, and assassinated for trying to find a better life for their family. And so much of this is linked to U.S. policy and comes from U.S. taxpayer dollars. And so we're here calling attention to that. We're here gathering in solidarity on this day. And so thank you for being here, taking time out of your day. And with that, I will introduce Dana. Professor Dana, Dr. Dana Frank. Dana Frank is a professor from the University of California, Santa Cruz, and Honduran expert. Dana is a well-known scholar and author of 6 books, including Bananeras, Women Transforming the Banana Unions of Latin America, and recently released a new book titled The Long Honduran Night, Resistance, Terror in the United States in the Aftermath of the Coup. Since 2009 military coup in Honduras, she has been sought after by numerous media outlets, including the New York Times, Foreign Affairs, and The Nation, and testified for both the U.S. Congress and the Canadian Parliament. So we're just thrilled and honored to have her here with us. If we could have a little round of applause. I'll pass it to you.
Thank you so much. You want this back? Wait, those are beautiful. Thank you so much, and thank you to Pastor Rice. Excuse me, I'm watching your name. When your name is Frank, you get off easy for life. This beautiful congregation here, and I got to meet some of the Hondurans that you're helping, and that was a beautiful thing. And seeing the link between faith-based work here in the United States, U.S. foreign policy, the world of Honduran activism, and our place in this is a really beautiful thing. And thank you for all that. Thanks to Liz Montan and Louise Roberts. Thanks to Jenna Gray Eagle, who just made me this beautiful lanyard. And thanks. I also want to say thank you for having me in this sacred space. I've spoken in churches, but always in the community room and never actually in the sacred space. So I'm very honored and sort of daunted by that. May I also say I'm from Northern California. My mom grew up in the San Joaquin Valley of California, where there are a lot of Mennonite communities. So I was familiar with Mennonites to a certain extent. Growing up, they were in our world. What I'm going to do here is first talk a little bit about the book itself, and then I'm going to talk about the content of the book framed around the question of the root causes of the caravans. because it's probably what brought most of you here. It's what's put Honduras in the news recently, and it's probably the question you're thinking about. And in the course, so I'm going to talk mostly about the security issues and economic issues and the government issues in Honduras, but then talk about U.S. policy and support for that. Vicious government. Saying these things in the church is a little strange, talking about the hard parts. And then I'll talk about resistance and activism in Honduras. And then I'll talk about U.S. Congress and what you can do here and link the dots for all of us. And then we can have time for question and answer. I'm trying not to have to look at this, it distracts me visually. So let me just tell you about a little who I am. I spent most of my life, I'm actually Professor Emerita, which means retired girl professor in Latin. I just retired in June. And I spent most of my life actually teaching U.S. history and writing about labor movement and women and race and ethnicity and immigration. And about 20 years ago, I got pulled in to working with the coalition of Latin American banana workers, especially in Honduras, to help develop a union label for unionized bananas for the U.S. market. So I was sort of brought in, it was sort of this obscure thing that I was the only person that ever researched, and I started working with them on this project for a few years, starting in 2000. That went nowhere for lots of good reasons, but I started doing solidarity work with banana unions because they were so amazing, and ended up writing a little activist book about the women's projects that both the men and women work on about empowering women and analysis of gender within the context of the banana unions of Honduras. And after that, I started researching Honduran labor history and the history of intervention by the FL-CIO in Honduras during the Cold War. And at the time of the coup, which was in June 2009, 10 years ago this June, I was pretty much checked out. I'm like, it's too hot and humid here. That was 10 years, 8, 9 years. I'm gonna go work with broccoli workers or coffee workers. There's a better climate. It's very hot and humid anywhere that bananas grow. And I was really thinking about moving on with my life. And on the morning of June 28, 2009, the military of Honduras, with collusion of the Supreme Court and majority of Congress, put the democratically elected president of Honduras on a plane, stopped at a U.S. Honduran Joint Air Force base, and then flew him in famously in his pajamas to Costa Rica. And that has cast Honduras into a hellhole ever since. And every morning ever since then, I've gotten up in the morning and said, what power do I have to stop this? And it really changed my whole life. My joke is I became a Honduran freedom fighter. But let me tell you, when your closest friend down there was thrown into the back of a truck on top of 15 other people by the military on the 5th or 6th day, and was in detention for several hours till we got her out, when something's happened to one loved one of yours, you don't know what's going to happen to everybody else. And so the urgency of how could I be useful has driven my life ever since. And for the first couple of years, there was no solidarity movement in place here in the United States. There weren't a lot of, most Hondurans that could speak English were pro-coup elites or for a lot of undocumented folks. So there wasn't a natural network, and it took us a while to all find each other. And mostly I was just writing op-eds, articles in newspapers, trying to get anybody published. And for the most part, nobody would publish them. Nobody would publish any of us for the first couple of years. And I started writing articles for The Nation in those years, and I was very, very grateful for them because no one else was publishing anything about Honduras. Eventually I got in the New York Times, and that sort of changed my legitimacy, and a lot of it, in 2012, a lot of other things happened in the media that made us possible to at least get people to pay attention to the disaster that was developing. So what happened is, the origins of the book is, over the course of maybe 7 or 8 years, I wrote almost 40 different op-eds and articles in foreign policy magazines, and they all started to sound the same. I started calling them Dano's latest atrocity report from Honduras. It was like, this terrible thing just happened, here's how it's tied with the coup, here's how the US government is supporting it, here's how Congress is pushing back, here's what Obama should do instead. And of course Obama wasn't doing what I said he should do. And so I started, after 2 or 3 years, I started going to Congress and doing a lot of work in Congress. It took me about a year to crack the code of power, working with a lot of people in Honduras and also, Washington, and also constituents all over the place, and I'll talk about that at the end. But also as a writer, I was still writing the stuff that was deadly. And before I had done creative writing, not creative nonfiction, something that sort of was piece sort of much more creative, and I felt like I was dying as a writer. So I started writing stories just for myself or for the creative process about things that had happened to me in Honduras or in Washington. Just stories that worked as stories, and some of them were terrible and some of them were funny and some of them were both. And I eventually had most of a whole book of those stories, and I showed it to a publisher and they said, oh, well, memoir doesn't sell. And I'm like, well, it's not exactly memoir. We want the big narrative. And I wasn't ready to write the big narrative because it was too painful to go back through it all. This was by the time 8 years after the coup, 7 years. And eventually decided that stories had to have the context. So the book, the resultant book, is about a third those stories embedded into the larger narrative. So I go back and forth between the big narrative, and that's about 2/3 of the book, the big narrative of the resistance, the repression, the details of US policy, and what happened in Washington, and all different forms of the resistance, and I alternate that with my individual stories that illustrate those. The first chapter, you're really with me in the streets of Honduras. It's not so much about me doing anything, it's just about pulling you into the joys and terrors and high of that first year of resistance, and especially what I saw when I went down there. And then after that, it really alternates. So the book, and also I feel like so that's what sort of how the book evolved. Also, I don't think it's possible to just write a book that you just read about all the terrible things, right? In the third person, it makes it possible for the reader to sort of have a break to digest. And I know, Rod, you've read the book, so I hope this helped. You know, it gives you a little mental break or something, a different wavelength. And there were a lot of decisions I made about writing the book, and one was, there's a chapter, the third chapter, and there are 6 chapters. The third one is about the work in Congress in 2012 and 13, and in some way, and I had permission of all of us on the team that worked on solidarity work that worked Congress. We gave away our playbook. So it says, we did this, we worked with this office. There's all these books about solidarity, they say, and then Congress did this. As if Congress woke itself up and did that. And there's always an invisibility of the actual work that you do, and also the work of the aides, and how you work with aides, and that's how it happens, along with, of course, constituent pressure and other forms of pressure. And so it's really a toolbox, a toolkit about how we did it, and I also got some aides to agree to let me talk about working with them, which is very, very unusual. And all of us agreed, those of us in the solidarity work agreed that I was going to go public with this, because it also tells the Honduran right and the State Department how we did it too, right? But it also means that younger activists can come along and see how to do it, and even see the cast of characters. There's also, so it's written for activists, there's also a lot of what I call the weedy details. You might have heard the concept of being in the weeds, which means going into technical things in government usually. And but I wanted people to see and experience as readers in lifetime how US imperialism works. Because, you know, I spent my life teaching US history. I knew the big picture, I had critical thinking, but watching how the State Department lies and manipulates and maneuvers and response and counter moves was unbelievable. And I wanted the reader to experience that in detail. So it's like one thing to say the State Department lies, it's another to see how slippery they stay within the seeming truth while it's still lying, you know, and watching how that has played out. I think I wanted those details in the book. And also, sometimes I'm just having fun as a writer, most prominently in the section that I took out, put back in 3 times, and then it ended up being the one that got excerpted, which is the one called 0 to Axe Murders in 13 minutes. And it opens with, when exactly did I start using the term axe murders all the time? As in, the president of Honduras is an axe murderer. And then I'm making axe murder jokes, but I'm also talking about the impossibility of communicating to somebody in 13 minutes what's really going on, and the heartbreak of that, and also black humor as well. 2 final things about the book itself. The research, some of it was reporting I did at the time for The Nation. Some of it was my own clipping files. Some of it was, I wrote very detailed emails to congressional aides for many, many years, and I could go back and see everything I told them in lifetime, and long reports I wrote after trips. And I'm a professional historian, or at least I used to be, and you couldn't replicate that, right? You wouldn't be able to go back and have all that. Oral history doesn't work the same way. And finally, I do want to underscore that the book is from the point of view of a white middle-class US citizen, who I have the ability to get on a plane and leave. I get respected, I speak English, I have professor next to my name, so I cross the border, I cross into Washington with all those privileges that other people that do this work don't have. And also it's less risky for me because I can do things and again get out of Honduras, and Hondurans don't have that privilege. And there's just things I don't understand. I'm not Honduran, and it's a book about Honduras. So I would just underscore that, although I have been working and embedded very deeply with Honduras for 20 years now. So now I'm just going to talk about the content of the book, and then I'll get to the activism side of it at the end. And I kind of want to make a big point about the origins of the caravan. A lot of the time when we read about the origins of the caravan in Honduras, it's just what I have myself came to call the river of horror. It's the sort of river floating with dead bodies, that's all it is. Everything is completely terrible. Now those things are all true, the terrible things are all true, they're probably worse than you know, but that's always been balanced with activism and hope and joy and struggle and joy in daily life for the Honduran people. They're not, the media tends to talk about Hondurans as nothing but suffering, powerless, hopeless victims. And they are not, while they are suffering, they are not hopeless, they are not powerless, and I'll show you that. And they're always looking for strategies. And often the way, okay, and also if you look at the way the origins of why people are fleeing is usually cast as they're fleeing gangs and violence and poverty. Now they are actually, yes, fleeing gangs and violence and poverty. I'm going to unpack those. But those are not a natural disaster. They're the product of policies and practices of the post-Coup Honduran government backed by the United States, okay? So it's not only is this not a natural disaster, and the notion, there's also this sort of long racist notion in US foreign policy and mainstream culture that the little brown people can't govern themselves. That Latin Americans in particular, along with people in the Philippines or Africa, they somehow naturally can't govern themselves. We need to go down there and teach them how to govern themselves. And of course, we, the United States government, ends up backing dictators and repressive governments, creating the very terrible chaos that then gets blamed on the victims. So I would certainly also say the other soundbite here is that these people are refugees from US policy. They're refugees, as the UN would say, and refugees from US policy. So first I want to talk a little bit about the violence and the gangs, and then I'll talk about drug traffickers, and then I'll talk about the economy and poverty. Well, when the coup happened, and I don't know how many of you remember the coup, it was in 10 years, June 28, and it was a big surprise, and it was the military, the whole top of the government did it in collusion. I'm fine with it that way, so I like it better that way. Are you not going to be able to record me? Okay. I usually talk too loud. Get screwed over a little bit so I can look at it. It's an eyesight thing, sorry. The coup itself was a criminal act that overthrew the government and the rule of law and constitutional order. But it also threw the whole rule of law out the window. And the concept of rule of law and constitutional order were not phrases that I had in my vocabulary in English at the time. We think about them a lot more now since Trump came in. You know, we now have to talk about these things here, right? But it meant that it not only was a criminal act, but it meant that all criminal behavior was possible, because it threw out the judicial system, it threw out any regulation of the police, the prosecutors, you name it. The Congress became spectacularly corrupted, and all the way up from the Attorney General all the way down to the grassroots. Now, it's not like there was a golden age for Honduras before the coup, but it wasn't rampant criminality, and the coup just opened the door to you can do anything you want. Most famously, the murder rate shot to the top of highest murder rate in the world. By 2 years into that, it's stayed there ever since. The Honduran government will say, oh, it's been cut in half since then. Don't believe a word they say. We only know the government itself, the murderous government itself, asserting this, and the State Department will repeat that in order to support the Honduran government. The impunity rate for homicides is somewhere around 90 to 95%, according to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights a few years ago. That means that 95% of homicides, nothing happens to the person who committed it. Now multiply that toward all crimes, and you get a sense of what's been going on in the country. You can kill anything you want, anyone you want, well, anything you want to, and nothing happened to you, okay? So in that context, the gangs really took off and proliferated and into all these networks within all the communities and got bigger and bigger. They do kill people routinely who resist them, who won't join. They rape young women who are not don't make themselves sexually available. They're vicious and they kill people all the time, and a lot of the dead bodies that are found in the streets, and the government, by the way, doesn't count them as homicides if they're found in plastic bags or they're as part of a massacre, which tells you something about the statistics. And this is where you get the river of blood or the river of horror. The police are deeply corrupt, as much as 75% of the police. Between 2011 and 2012 and 13, the National Director of Police was documented to have been a death squad leader in 2003. The U.S. continued to celebrate him and work with him, and he was brought in to clean up the police, and it's been like that ever since. The police are very much locked in with the gangs. For example, one of the things the gangs now do in the last 3 or 4 years is they have these extortion rackets. So if you have a small business or you're a cab driver or a bus driver, they come around once a week to collect money from you, and they calculate very exactly of what will make it possible for you not quite to go bankrupt, and then they take the rest. And if you resist it, that you're killed. And cab drivers and bus drivers are just killed daily in Honduras because of this, and also small business people. And I know some small business people in a small city on the edge of San Pedro Sula, and when the gangs first came around to pay the tax, a vegetable seller half a block down from my friend's store didn't pay it, and she and her kids were shot up in the street. A friend of theirs, a very close friend, their barber, a block away, filed a police report. 2 weeks later, someone came and killed him. It was all caught on video. Nothing happened. And then a year or two later, an old man who had a record store around the corner put his hand on the arm of the woman that came around to collect and said, "I'm tired of this. I'm an old man. I'm sick." And by this point, because of publicity about this, the government had sent in police and military to patrol the streets. So you can see these teams walking around to protect people from the gangs and extortionists and from crime. And so after the old man did that, the police and the military disappeared from the streets for 2 days. Somebody came and killed the old man. The next day, the police and military were back, okay? And so you can see this kind of clear collusion, as in when you file a police report about the gangs and you get killed. At the very, very top of the police, the director, the Minister of Security, who's a former general, has twice been named in U.S. federal court for being a drug trafficker. The new national director of the police and the 2 guys under him that were appointed a year ago have all been documented by the Honduran government itself to be drug traffickers, and the Associated Press broke that story a year ago. Nothing's happened except the police threatened to sue the Associated Press and seize their phone records. These are the people at the very top. It's not a few bad apples, and it's not something you can solve from a little program in a community, like if you saw the New York Times op-ed a few days ago, like here's their model anti-gang project, where they're working with these exact communities who kill people. The military is especially tried in with drug traffickers. They use military planes and helicopters to move drugs in and out of Honduras. And again, the president's brother, Tony. The president is named Juan Orlando Hernandez. His brother's named Tony, and I always call them Tony, Orlando, and Don, if you're old enough to remember that band. Well, his brother Tony, who was a prominent congressman, is now in jail in the United States because he was a major cartel leader and also moving arms. And now and of course you tell me we don't all know what our brothers and sisters do, but it's very implausible that the president didn't know what his brother, so the evidence has closed in on the president about drug trafficking. So when the U.S. works with the security forces, when we fund them, we are working with the drug traffickers, the very top of the police and military, and of course the drug traffickers kill people all the time. They kill each other, they kill people who refuse to cooperate, they kill people who ask a favor and then won't do more or won't carry something, and so that's a lot of the homicide rate. The other piece of the homicide rate is so-called femicides, which is domestic violence has shot out the ceiling. So women get killed all the time at a very high rate. Of course, it's terrible when men get killed too, but there's a lot of skyrocketing violence against women, sexualized violence against women, that also leads to women's dead bodies showing up in the streets. Let me get my glass of water. I will try to dump it on the music stand, which would be my best technique. The second piece of what they're fleeing, and this is true, is poverty. But again, the poverty is not a natural disaster. The poverty is a result of the Honduran government and U.S. support for it very specifically. The vast majority of the Honduran economy, there's almost no middle class. The vast majority of the economy belongs to 13 oligarch families that have controlled the economy for decades and decades. And they're the ones that ran the coup. They control the dominant party. And they have just stolen the government coffers blind. I'll come back to that. But one of the things that happened when the coup happens and this destruction of the rule of law is you don't get international investment, because international investments, unless they're really going to make raw profits like Canadian mining companies or Canadian textile companies, for the most, there's all kinds of investments that don't happen, because if you don't have property relations, rule of law, a lot of things that even corporate investors want, you don't have. But also, a lot of what gets called development and development aid is actually what's driving the destruction of livelihoods and people fleeing. And if you look at sector, there's something called the Alliance for Prosperity that the U.S. has been and is now certain elements are promoting. And if you look at it sector by sector, it's exactly the engines that are driving people to flee and creating poverty. One of the biggest one is palm oil. And that's palm oil, African palms, the oil of African palms. And it's seen as like a biofuel or a safe oil, when actually the owners of the palm oil companies is mostly a man named Miguel Facuse, he's dead now, but he was the richest man in the country, a private security army of at least 200 people that has allegedly participated with police and military to kill at least 100 campesino small farmers defending their lands and trying to recuperate stolen lands, because the government policy was to support these 2 or 3 associates, super rich, forcing campesino small farmer collectives off their land and planting it in African palms instead. African palms are very destructive of the economy, well, that too. They're destructive of the environment. They suck all the water out. They use inputs that are destructive of the environment, but also they are being planted on lands that are these lands of campesinos who keep trying to defend them and then recuperate their lands, and then are getting killed 1 by 1, 2 by 2 with almost complete impunity ever since the coup. Another sector that matters in terms of this in palm oil is land that belongs to the Garifuna people, who are Afro-Indigenous people that settled all along the coast of Belize, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua. And they are fishing villages of people that speak their own language and have lived there for 3 centuries now. And a lot of that land, also the palm oil producers want it, but also, if you hear about tourist development in Honduras, this is the prime coastal Caribbean land. Lagoons and stuff that developers have their eye on that, and Garifuna people get killed defending their land from tourism. Most famously are the hydroelectric dam projects, and here again, economic development. And they're owned by the elites or by foreign corporations, and that's what Berta Cáceres, 3 years ago today, was assassinated working with her people, the Lenca people, to defend the Guadalcarque River against a hydroelectric dam. And these dam projects are destroying the Honduran environment all over the country, and it's part of an energy corridor to eventually move energy north to the United States that is just gutting the Honduran landscape, but it's also on indigenous lands where people have legal rights that are being abrogated. The other piece of this is mining, often by Canadian mining companies, but also Honduran elites, where indigenous people are being killed in land struggles defending their land against mining projects that are illegal, don't have legal licenses. And the other big piece of the economy in its formal sense is the maquiladoras, which are export processing plants. Maybe 140,000 people work in them. But again, and they make apparel for the US and Canadian and European market. But those plants, they only hire young people. Those people work 12 hours a day, 6 or 7 days a week, no air conditioning, and it's really destructive to their bodies. I know young people, or that used to work in them, they bleed cotton dust all day, they go blind from looking at the sewing machine. Often there's no bathroom. I mean, it's really terrible, terrible working conditions. So when you hear about economic development, you can see that this is actually what people are fleeing. right? I mean, there's nothing, almost nothing else. There's some work in agriculture that's really, really brutal too. So it's not, even what is seen as the solution is actually what's part of a big driver of of poverty. The last thing about the economy and what people are fleeing is the whole question of the state and state sector. Because what happened after the coup is the state was just robbed blind. And I'm not just exaggerating. For example, there were very strong teachers' unions, very, very important for resisting the coup. They had their own separate law under the Honduran government that made them very stable, and they had a big, huge pension fund. And I'm talking about somebody who's now drawing on a government pension fund, so I understand what this means. And the entire teachers' pension fund disappeared in the 6 months after the coup. No one knows where that went. There's nobody even investigating it, okay, as far as I know. And so multiply that times most of the Honduran state, and the agencies are constantly going bankrupt because the money just disappears and it ends up in the hands of the elite. Then the Honduran government goes bankrupt and borrows money from the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank. And then those policies in turn drive the further dismantlement of the state through privatizations, which is one of the reasons for the coup in the first place, because the elites didn't want the previous president, although he was sort of a center-right guy, he was stopping privatization. So since the coup, the electrical company, the telephone company, now the start of the ports and the National Health Service, they're all being privatized and broken up, and now they don't function. And now the electrical company doesn't function. In fact, just saw a story in the paper yesterday, the Development Bank is going to give money to the electrical company so they can have electricity, right? You know, so again, they just steal the money, destroy services, and then the development banks come in. There's a quote in my book from the executive committee of the International Monetary Fund about 4 years ago when they said, they gave Honduras $100 million and said, we're helping them lower their wage bill. We're helping them lower their wage bill, meaning the Honduran government in that sense. Well, what does that mean? Like, okay, we're helping them pay workers less or lay them off. And in fact, government workers, by the tens and tens of thousands, have been laid off in the last few years because of these policies, and also because the government, they have very strong unions, and the government just wiped out these unions by just wiping out the agency. And then they formed maybe a new little one after that. You know, I was looking at the IMF website a couple weeks ago as part of some research in what the most recent loans are, that now they say we're helping them right-size their wage bill. I'm trying to figure out what right-size means. I think it was just sort of a polite way of saying laying off workers and cut their pay. Most famously, in terms of the state and corruption, there used to be a very functioning National Health Service. It was called Social Security. It also had a pension branch that had, still has, but it had a whole chain of hospitals and healthcare providers that was pretty good. And middle-class people went there, working-class people in the formal economy went there. People paid into it through payroll taxes. Employers, small businesses paid payroll taxes into it. And what happened in 2013 is about $90 million were stolen from the National Health Service, bankrupting it. At least 3,000 people died that year as a result, but it still barely functions. There's no dialysis machines. The nurses and doctors routinely don't get paid. It became this national disaster. And in 2015, a journalist, David Romero, revealed that checks that showed that maybe as much as $50 to $80 million had been stolen from the National Health Service and transferred into the president's election campaign and also that of the ruling party. And and it's all true. You can see the checks, you can see the bank accounts. Even the government and even the Attorney General has admitted that that the records are real, and nothing has ever happened. So you have this so then what you're having is this gutting of state services, just spectacular corruption, with the collusion by the Attorney General, by top to bottom of the government. So just to wrap that part up, people are, yes, fleeing gangs, violence, and poverty, but those are the direct results of state policies following the coup, economic policies, and the corruption of the security forces. And if you, I'm sure a lot of you have read these beautiful interviews with people in caravans or talked to people here, and over again they say, I'm fleeing the police. There's at least 3 former opposition Congress members that have been in caravans in the last year that have gotten death threats. There was a story that ACLU did with the actress Maggie Gyllenhaal organized it, and they got all these movie stars to read, this was last summer, to read the story of a woman named Maria about why she came in. She said she had reported electoral fraud by the president's party and gotten death threats and had to flee as a result. I mean, there's just a lot of this police repression. It's not just poverty and gangs that they're fleeing. And so that if you see this, it's really important to see it as politically constructed. Okay, it's not a natural disaster. And it's been backed by the United States at every turn. The U.S. supported the coup. It supported what had happened after some brief fudging. It supported the stabilization of the coup. It recognized a fraudulent election that happened 5 months after the coup, that all international observers and most countries in the world would not recognize. The only observers was the Republican Party, the United States, and a guy named Pepe Lobo, Porfirio Lobo, came in at that point. And has continued to support these regimes despite spectacular repression and human rights abuses and assassinations with impunity. The figure to know now is, just to wrap up, is a guy named Juan Orlando Hernandez, the president, and he's always referred to as Juan Orlando, which is his compound first name, but also by his initials, J-O-H, Juan Orlando Hernandez, and it's like FDR or LJ, okay? And this is really important because the slogan is Fuera Ho. Okay, so the J-O-H is ho, and fuera means get out. So you'll hear fuera ho all over the place. In fact, somebody was just telling me that they went and worked with some immigrants, and recent immigrants, and they said, the immigrants said fuera ho, and if you answered back fuera ho, that meant you understood what their politics were. Although lots of people are terrified to say that, because of course they can get deported and killed if they return. So Juan Orlando was a member of Congress at the time of the coup and supported as a congressional committee. He was a leader, as president of Congress in 2012, 4 years after the coup. He was the leader of something called the technical coup, in which he overthrew the Supreme Court at 3 in the morning. 4 out of 5 members of the constitutional part of the Supreme Court, which is like our Supreme Court, 4 out of 5 of them were deposed at 3 in the morning and new justices named the next day. Hello? You can't do that? This is like here. I mean, they're not for life there, but they have 7-year terms. And the 5th one that wasn't deposed has been the Attorney General, was named the Attorney General 6 months later, has been the Attorney General ever since, and accepted an illegal reappointment last summer, at which the U.S. tweeted celebrating him. And that the Honduran Constitution says very clearly that no sitting president or vice president can run for re-election. In fact, they cannot even advocate it or advocate it, okay? So the president, that Supreme Court that Juan Orlando had illegally created in the middle of the night in the so-called technical coup, then ruled that the re-election was possible. They said, well, the Constitution violates international norms of human rights, therefore it's okay. It's just like here, you can't just throw the Constitution out the window. It's not like an ambiguous clause. Some of the parts about militarization are somewhat ambiguous. This part is not. And the U.S. just said, oh, it's up to Hondurans to decide their democratic processes, right? Giving the green light to Juan Orlando's re-election. So if you look at U.S. policy, it's not like, oh, they supported the coup and then they've been worried ever since. It's green light after green light after green light, up to the most recent period. Not this last November, the one before, Juan Orlando did in fact run for re-election, and there was a united opposition of Libre, the center-left party, which I'll talk about in a sec, and a guy named Salvador Nasrallah, who's sort of a nutcase, but our nutcase, a centrist sportscaster. They are all united against Juan Orlando, and really many, many people from the traditional right parties were all voting for Nasrallah. And when the election, just like here, the election results start coming in the night of the election, and when 57% of the votes are in, the election commission said that Nasrallah was ahead by like 8 or 9%, 9 or 10%. and that one of the members of the election commission said the rest of the results are consistent. So for about 3 hours, the Honduran people, and also myself, many of us actually thought they were going to be allowed to have democracy. They were allowed to change the government through democratic process. After about an hour or two after that, the Honduran government shut down, announced that the computers had shut down. The computers were shut down for 2 days. And then gradually over the course of the next week and a half, results were allowed to come out officially 5% at a time until after a week and a half, Juan Orlando won by 1.5%. Okay, now this was denounced as electoral fraud by all over the world, including by the Organization of American States that said that there should be a new election. The US hedged and then recognized Juan Orlando. And the Honduran people reacted with, to quote a friend of mine, with rage and grief, because it was even worse, and also what other paths are left now, right? And you have to understand the caravan in the context of this. It's not like they can call their Congress member, right? I mean, they do have votes in Congress, but they never come anywhere near they don't come near the majority. And to see the election so baldly stolen, the time before it was unclear who had won, but this time it was very clear that the opposition had won, and then of course the U.S. recognizes the government and has backing him ever since. And not just, there's a lot of security funding that flows in from the United States. We can talk about it later. We don't actually know how much because it's not transparent. But also hundreds of millions of dollars in development money for these very sectors, or to the corrupt police, to all kinds of things. But also the US legitimates by treating this as a legitimate government that's not a vast human rights abuser. And the hypocrisy of how the US supports Juan Orlando and then attacks Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua and attacks Maduro in Venezuela. Now, I'm not going to defend either Maduro or Ortega, but it's very similar behavior, sometimes identical behavior by Juan Orlando Hernandez Honduras, and he gets celebrated. And the new head of the Southern Command was just down there recently and said they're a great partner, a good partner. Pompeo said the same thing on the phone. And now Honduras is supporting the U.S. in sending the humanitarian aid to the border in Venezuela, and the U.S. just celebrated them. They're going to move looks like they're going to move their embassy in Israel to Jerusalem, so you can see the geopolitical politics of that. You know who John Kelly is, used to be Trump's chief of staff. He used to be the head of the United States Southern Command before that, and he said that Juan Orlando was doing a great job, impressive job of fighting drug trafficking. I'm like, hello? And he also, Kelly was briefly head of Homeland Security before he was chief of staff, and he said that Juan Orlando was a great guy and a good friend. And AP has a really good story a year ago, April, if you're interested in Kelly and Juan Orlando. So it's not just like we're looking the other day, we actually celebrate this government. And why? And the big question is why. A lot of this is geopolitical. It goes back to the Monroe Doctrine, the U.S.'s notion that it has a right to control the whole hemisphere and that the hemisphere should be subservient to U.S. interests. And then also now, you could see this coming a couple of years ago, the new Cold War, so using the idea that China and Russia are about to take over the whole hemisphere if we don't have allies, and so we're dancing dictators because if we don't, Russia and China are going to move in and they're going to be on our shores tomorrow. And you say this to Hondurans and they just laugh because they don't see China there, and also they're like, hello, give us our chances because it could not be any worse than what the U.S. continues to do. And that Juan Orlando would not be there for 5 minutes without U.S. support. There's also just this policy of just keeping the hemisphere as safe as the U.S. can get it for transnational corporations. So it's not like one company like United Fruit in the 50s and 60s, but it's this larger climate of transnational capitalism. And you can see it with Canada more clearly with the mining companies and the textile companies, and it's all locked in together. And then, as I've been working on this for 10 years and trying to figure it out, the military is also an engine that runs of itself. And Kelly, when he was head of Southern Command, the different commands of the regional commands, they compete with each other for federal funding in Congress. And at one point, Kelly even said, this was like after Ebola had been going on for 6 months, there's no sign of Ebola in Central America ever, but I've ever heard of it. He said, if Ebola comes to Central America, they're all going to come north, and it's going to be, Katie, bar the barn doors. In other words, this panic of invasion of infected Central Americans. And I'm like, what? And he later admitted to, a friend of mine was a witness to this, that he said that only in part to get more money for the Southern Command. Right, so you can. That's when I really got it about, because people had said this. So finally, let me just talk about the resistance and including us. Because the last piece of the media coverage, or one of the last two pieces, is that it doesn't talk about the fact that 100 people have ideas for their own democracy, and they have waves after wave after wave of powerful resistance and organizing. They're not just passive victims here, as I said at the beginning. When the coup happened, this incredible coalition came together. Some pieces had been in place, but really surprised everybody. It was the coalition of the labor movement, the women's movement, the Jesuits and others in the faith community, small farmers, campesinos that were organized, indigenous people, and the Afro-Indigenous Garifuna people, labor, the human rights community, and a lot of middle-class people, some of whom had been part of the Liberal Party part that supported the deposed president, but also that were committed to the rule of law and constitutional order because they knew how long Latin Americans had fought for that as opposed to military dictatorships. And that coalition held together for like 2 years, really amazingly. And a lot of it came from social movements from below. And then in 2011, the deposed president was allowed to return back to the country in a complicated deal. And part of the formal resistance formed a political party called Libre. The other part of the resistance said, the more social movement said, we're not ready for this, it's going to lead to opportunism and patronage and the resurgence of the traditional liberal party that Zelaya came from. But that party, but also everybody voted for Libre, sort of like we might vote for Democrat, Polarized and vote for the certain elements of the Democratic Party as part of national political strategy. And Libre is the first center-left party in all of Honduran history. And they got, in the 2013 elections, probably Xiomara Castro, Zelaya's wife, ran for president. She probably won. We don't know. She was ahead in the polls, and they shut down the polls a month before the election. Of course, that ruling party controlled the electoral machinery, but it wasn't so clear that it was stolen. We don't really know. They certainly became the second largest party in Congress. So they went from 0 to it was like they had 36 members to 48 from the ruling party. So they did quite well, and that disappears from the story that people actually have built a whole new political party. In 2015, when it became clear, the news broke about Juan Orlando having stolen the money from the National Health Service, this huge movement, you might have seen this in the New York Times at the time, a movement called Indignados, or Outraged Ones. And there were these really beautiful marches on Friday nights, just as it got dark, of people carrying tiki torches. It's like, you might have in your backyard. And they carried them to symbolize the people that had died because of the National Health Service. And those marches, all in almost every town in the country, got bigger and bigger until I saw the two biggest ones in the capital, and one had 75,000 and one had 60,000. And I've been in demonstrations that had 500,000, 1 million people, of course, in my lifetime, and nothing was ever as beautiful as those. Because we passed over the boulevard, and you could see as far as you could see from an overpass. As far as you can see in both directions, all these people holding up these torches, and it was unbelievably powerful. And the people in the marches, and I interviewed a lot of them, and other people have written about them, they were middle-class people. They were not the people from those social movements, although the social movements people somewhat ambivalently started joining them, because a lot of them were coup supporters. The people in these marches that had had enough with the corruption of their health system and with the corruption of the government. And they were small business people and professionals, and then many, many other people joined us because you're just like, let's please, can we? And the slogan of the whole thing was Fuera Ho, Juan Orlando out, and that the Attorney General resign. And also they wanted a commission on impunity from the United Nations, like the very successful long-term one in Guatemala. And that was the demand. And the US stepped in and pushed aside the UN proposal and instead created something called the MACHI through the Organization of American States. It's controlled the United States. It has very few powers. They've done some good things, including charging some Congress people like a year ago with corruption, but the Congress immediately passed a law giving itself immunity for the previous 3 years. So, and also the MACHI often functions by the State Department or the Honduran government to say, look, we're cleaning things up, when in fact has very little powers, and it never touches the very top of the government. It doesn't touch the president, it doesn't touch the Attorney General, who's sitting on the evidence in thousands of cases, and just accepted an illegal reappointment last July. It doesn't touch the President of Congress, it doesn't touch the head of the National Party. So it's always the previous administration or farther down, making it look like, now the exception is the President's brother, But that was not the Machi, that was actually the Southern District of New York that the State Department doesn't control. That was Pre-Barrara, if you've heard of him. So this Southern District of New York, the state, I always thought, well, they were in cahoots with the State Department. And I just did not believe they were independent until I asked the State Department about them. Various ambassadors and people in the State Department, they always get this like foul look on their face, like, we hate those people, which made me actually decide that I mean, they do tell the State Department right before they arrest somebody or try to extradite somebody, but they are in fact independent. And finally, when the election was stolen, just over a year ago, people really poured into the streets. Now, what are they supposed to do? They tried to say this is an illegitimate government, and they poured in the streets. They did road blockages very, very bravely at this point because so many people have been killed. And they did it for days and days and days, and the government responded with using live bullets against protesters for the first time, and they had not done that since the coup. People have been selectively assassinated, but now they started taking assault rifles and just firing them into crowds or just shooting up bystanders. And according to the UN, at least 22 people were killed by security forces, mostly military, and some of them were just bystanders. And you can see the videos of the bullets just being shot over the line and into a crowd indiscriminately. Nobody's gone to jail for any of that. It's a whole year later. There's been a lot of publicity. So this is, and now still, ever since then, they're now using live bullets against a Chiquita worker strike last spring, against protests in the last month over the inauguration. So that's where we are right now. But you never know any of this from the media, right? They're just suffering, quietly suffering people invading, or they're either invaders or they're quiet victims, okay? When actually they're carrying Fuera signs when they crossed the border into Guatemala last spring, you know? I mean, these people, now some of these people are not that political, but they're being these political processes supported by our government. They are not victims, and they have, sometimes you'll get, well, there was a crisis after the elections, or there was post-election violence. Which, watch the language in the newspapers, because the violence was not committed by the protesters. It was committed by the military and the police. The protesters didn't kill anybody, you know? And so how that got turned into post-election violence, or there were protests and people died, that sounds like the cause and effect is the protesters. Right now, though, there's a very interesting convergence going on of many, many different forces, from Libre, the human rights community, the social movements, all those ones I named, but also Nasrallah, and even to his right, a guy named Luis Zelaya, no relation, who's sort of from one of the other remaining old right-wing party, and he's usually he's the favorite of the embassy. Even he has joined in this convergence, saying that there should be a new election, a provisional government and a new election. Of course, the embassy wants to get Luis Zelaya in there. He has no base. So it's very tricky for Libre to work with him in the same calling for a new election. But you can certainly, that if you want, what do the 100 people want? That's what people are calling for, and you don't see that in the news. The last thing I'll say here, which is not in the news, is that there's been tremendous pushback from the US Congress for years and years and years. As early as 2000, and the numbers are big. In 2013, maybe 14, 94 members of Congress signed a letter to Secretary of State saying suspend police and military aid. 94, that was almost half of the Democrats at that point, wasn't in the news, right? And you know, and that included Keith Ellison, Betty McCollum, a lot of local people. And you may have heard of the Berta Cáceres Human Rights in Honduras Act that calls for a suspension of police and military aid, but also no new vote that the U.S. votes no on any new loans for the multilateral development banks, the World Bank, the IMF, and the Inter-American Development Bank, because that's where the really big bucks come in. And in fact, there's new Inter-American Development Bank money just coming in today. And the Berta Cáceres Act, you don't hear that 71 members were on record last year. It's going to be reintroduced in the next 2 or 3 weeks. And of course, we want to get everybody in Minnesota, all the members on the bill. And I want to say that Keith Ellison, we've been working closely with him in the last few years when he was in Congress, and was an amazing leader on he and Jan Schakowsky were the two biggest leaders in the last 3 years, and he was amazing. And that Ilhan Omar is very much stepping up, very excited about working in Honduras. They were both down there with Witness for Peace, and they don't just, a lot of what I talk about in the book is that Congress didn't just wake itself up. it was all this grassroots work, and Minneapolis, St. Paul is the best, is the strongest in the country. You know, we don't just happen to care about Honduras here. Keith doesn't just, and Il Hondo just happen to be great. It's because of beautiful, beautiful grassroots work here in this area, a lot of it faith-based, and now that's converging, and I see this all over the country. I've just been on tour, converging with faith-based communities, providing sanctuary, working on asylum, and all the politics of immigration, and all that is converging. I wish I could say your senators have been great. Al Franken was kind of, Amy Klobuchar has been nowhere, and I don't know, nobody's asked you to do anything, but I don't know, I think we're barking at the wrong tree there. Also, there have been human rights conditions on part of the aid to Honduras since 2012, mostly thanks to Senator Patrick Leahy. And there is actually monies being withheld to Honduras that doesn't make it into the paper. In 2012, Leahy put $30 million of U.S. security funding on hold for like maybe a year. I don't know how long. It's just he doesn't talk about it, and it doesn't have the papers. But there actually is sometimes money does get withheld. The last thing I'll say is, we want to support the Verde Cáceres Act and other initiatives. The thing that's been happening in the last 2 months, you can see these things, some op-eds that are often tracked to people you've never heard of, who are tracked to Vanderbilt University, which is linked to the State Department, and of course this is the kind of stuff I do all day. Track the stuff that say, yes, the U.S. is responsible for some of the problems in Honduras. We shouldn't have supported the coup or whatever, and therefore we should give them even more money. And you'll hear this out there. And of course we want to say, yes, they need economic development. Yes, they need support. And you talk to Honduras and say, do not give 1 more cent to this government, right? And even the model projects like anti-gang end up being fronts for the larger support for the Honduran security forces, or they're ineffective at best. And even in the model neighborhood, the police just shot up a van. A man was driving his pregnant 14-year-old daughter to the hospital with 3 other kids in the car, and the police in the model neighborhood, in Rivera Hernandez, they just shot up the van with and these were like the model police that we're supposed to be working with, right? Injured 3 kids. So you also want to watch it. Our tendency is to say, let us give them more money to that government, but you're actually rewarding them for their behavior, right? And so it's very tricky, and what you have to say is like, no, do not legitimate that this is actually a government we should be working with in any way, and call for a new election, and a free and fair election that is not controlled by the United States, right? And so I'll just end there, and we'll see what kind of comments and questions you have.